Fentanyl is one of the most dangerous drugs in the world, contributing to tens of thousands of deaths every year. But very little is known about who actually makes this drug and who's really profiting from it. In this episode, we're uncovering the secrets of the fentanyl trade. I'm J.S. Raffaelli. I've spent years writing about drugs, why people take them, and why our governments chose to declare war on them. We make a lot of films advice about drugs, but in this show I get to dig a bit deeper. I get to talk to fellow expert drug nerds about their research into the crazy world of mind-altering substances. Ben Westhoff is an investigative journalist and leading expert on the emerging synthetic drugs market. He went undercover, infiltrating the labs in China where this drug is being produced on an industrial scale. Ben, welcome to News on Drugs.
Thanks for having me.
So for anyone who doesn't know, what is fentanyl and how is it different than heroin?
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that basically acts on the same receptors in the brain as heroin, morphine, opium, all that. The thing is, it's about 50 times stronger than heroin, and only 2 milligrams of fentanyl is enough to potentially make someone overdose.
And how did you personally end up investigating this drug in particular?
I had a friend who died from fentanyl patches. He was misusing them in 2010. He overdosed and died. Later, I was doing reporting on the rave scene, doing a story about why so many people were dying at raves. This was very strange because all the deaths were attributed to ecstasy, but I had been in the rave scene myself and never known ecstasy to be a particularly dangerous drug. So I went down the rabbit hole and learned that there was no pure MDMA really on the scene at all anymore. And all of the so-called ecstasy was being adulterated with these new synthetic chemicals. And they're called NPS, novel psychoactive substances. They were all made in a lab and they were all made in China. And almost no one knew anything about them. And so I went and found out that fentanyl was the most deadly among them all.
So we hear a lot about fentanyl in the news right now, but there's actually kind of a more interesting and complex backstory to this drug than most people are aware of, right?
Fentanyl was invented in 1959 by a Belgian chemist, and he was looking for an alternative to morphine for hospital procedures like open heart surgery. And the benefit of fentanyl is that it came on much faster, and also it went away faster. The problem is, though, the same thing that makes fentanyl a great drug for hospital use makes it a bad drug for illicit use. And that's because with heroin, if you take a dose, you won't need another one for most of the day. But fentanyl fades off so quickly that users have to re-up in 2 or 3 hours.
So the key moment in fentanyl's emergence is the North American opioids crisis. Can we look at how that kind of drove the explosion of synthetic opioids?
The only 2 major countries that have ever had a fentanyl problem are the US and Canada. What US and Canada have in common is that we had this opioid overprescription crisis. And so we've all heard about the Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, overprescribing opioids like OxyContin. And that set the table for millions of new opioid users. When their prescriptions ran out, they found themselves addicted to opioids. And so they filled this craving the only way they could, which was by buying heroin on the street. And eventually, there was basically not enough heroin to meet this demand. And so fentanyl basically rushed in to fill this void. And before long, there was a point where you couldn't find any heroin that wasn't cut with fentanyl.
And it was these fake pharmaceutical pills that led to the death of musicians like Prince, right?
Yeah, Prince and Tom Petty both took what they thought were actual pharmaceutical pills, but were actually cut with fentanyl. And that just goes to show that even people with a lot of money can't get the real thing anymore. The fentanyl has just utterly infiltrated the drug supply.
So who's actually making fentanyl?
The precursor chemicals are made in China. So these are the most important chemical ingredients to make fentanyl. And these chemicals are shipped on to Mexico, and the cartels finish the fentanyl to make the final product and then send it across the border. There are plenty of black market drug manufacturers in China who make every sort of illegal drug under the sun, but they're really outnumbered by these so-called gray market companies. And these gray market companies specialize in chemicals that are legal in China, but illegal in the US. And so that's been the focus of my research, and that's kind of the main types of companies that are driving this crisis.
But for quite a while, like from around 2010 onwards, these were completely legitimate companies, and you could just order fentanyl from China.
Yeah, before 2019, you could just go on the internet, type buy fentanyl in China, and a whole bunch of companies would come up. You could order it right to your door. You didn't even need to go on the dark web. It was just all really out there in the open. So in 2019, China finally blanket banned all fentanyl analogs. The only problem is that there's a cat and mouse game between the chemists and the government, because every time they crack down on a new fentanyl analog, the chemists will just tweak the molecular formula and make something else. And so we're getting an influx of all these novel new opioids in the US now.
And you've actually been out to China and seen these fentanyl and precursor labs. What was that like?
So I basically just started by Googling buy fentanyl in China, and the names of all these companies popped up, and their salespeople's contact information was right there. And so I made a fake name, fake avatar, and I just started reaching out to these companies and asking all sorts of information, posing as a customer. Eventually I said, well, if I were to come out to China, would you show me your facilities? And some of them said yes. And so I ended up seeing a fentanyl lab in Shanghai and went to this giant fentanyl precursors company in Wuhan.
So I'm assuming this isn't some kind of backwoods Breaking Bad kind of setup, right?
I met up with this chemist. We drove way out to the suburbs of Shanghai. I was really freaking out. The GPS on my phone didn't work. But when we got there, I was surprised. It was basically just like a suburban office park. And he used a key fob to get in with the mechanical arm to the parking lot. There was a big fountain. There weren't guys with AK-47s guarding the door. It was about 5 different rooms, fairly small labs, not very many employees, very kind of overpowering chemical smell when I walked in the door. But the amount of drugs they were making was really staggering. They focused on these fentanyl analogs and also K2 and spice, known as synthetic cannabinoids. They had packaged these drugs up into 1 kilo baggies, and there were huge barrels full of these baggies ready to be shipped all over the world. It really spoke to the demand worldwide for these drugs, because remember, only 2 milligrams of fentanyl is enough to make someone potentially overdose.
Strangely, when it comes to the fentanyl precursors, it actually seems like there's one giant company that dominates the entire market.
I was doing research into which companies were making these fentanyl precursors, and there were dozens and dozens of examples that came up in my searches. But as I investigated each one, I realized that these weren't individual companies. These were actually just shell companies of this larger conglomerate. And the name of it was Juan Chung, and their headquarters were in Wuhan. I determined that they were selling more fentanyl precursors than any other company in the world. And it turns out that they had a sales force of over 700 people working for them. When I visited this company, this was 2018, so it was before COVID. Yuan Chung was based out of this old hotel in this industrial section of Wuhan. It's basically a city known for really prestigious universities, and also it's home to the world's biggest chemical and pharmaceutical industries. I was shocked to see the sales floor where they were all in cubicles. It looked just like a regular Western office. They were basically selling the ingredients for this most dangerous drug like it was anything else.
And how is law enforcement struggling to deal with this? Like, how are they linking these deaths in America to factories in China?
When it became clear that China was exporting these new synthetic drugs like fentanyl that was causing so much death in America, the American government tried to put pressure on China in a number of different ways. Trump tried to tie the trade war. He raised tariffs and things like that. But the geopolitical relationship got really rocky after COVID because Trump was basically blaming China for it. And so China announced they were going to completely cut off relations when it comes to enforcing narcotics laws in China.
Because there have been some pretty clear instances where America has tried to extradite some of these people, and the Chinese authorities have refused to hand them over.
China has no extradition treaty with the US and really doesn't want to be told what to do. At the same time, they don't want to be seen as the drug pushers of the world. And so there has been some collaboration with these big drug kingpins who are exporting fentanyl and fentanyl products to the US. But someone like Juan from Juan Chung Corporation, who I met with, the US indicted him and offered a $5 million bounty for information relating to his capture. If he came to the US, for example, he could be arrested getting off the plane. But since he knows about this indictment, it's most likely he's just going to stay put.
And perhaps the crucial question in all of this is how have the Chinese government actively incentivized the growth of the fentanyl industry?
One of my key findings was that the Chinese government was actively supporting it through the tax structure. They actually provide value-added tax rebates. So, for example, when companies make fentanyl, they can write off all of their production costs and materials costs. And I don't think this was a conspiracy by the Chinese government to try to poison America, but it was just their financial incentives to help the chemical industry. The CEOs of these companies believe, as long as it's legal, my conscience is clear. And politicians at the top level who say, we don't want to be known as the drug pusher of the world, we shouldn't allow these chemicals. But then you have local provincial officials who see these companies bringing employment to the region, they're bringing tax dollars to the region, and they have a vested interest in kind of looking the other way.
Okay, so can we clear up some myths from reality around the idea that fentanyl is like being deliberately cut into other drugs like cocaine and weed?
It's a tough time to be a young person right now because basically, if you're experimenting with drugs, any pill, any powder that's acquired on the black market can be cut with fentanyl and often is. It seems weird, like why would someone cut cocaine, which is an upper, with fentanyl, which is a downer? But I think the reason is that fentanyl is so much cheaper, and like American drug consumers don't know the difference for the most part because we've always had terrible cocaine in this country, and what's sold as cocaine has only had a tiny portion of actual cocaine in it anyway. And if it makes people feel high in any sort of way, the distributors think they can get away with it.
And are we seeing even more dangerous developments now? I'm thinking specifically in terms of like the benzodope that's creeping into the American drug supply.
When China blanket banned all the fentanyl analogs in 2019, the good news was that we really did see a drop in the US. The problem was that all of these chemists in China just shifted to making different drugs. I believe benzos actually represent the next big drug crisis in the US. The problem is that benzos by themselves don't really kill people, but they're depressants. And so when they're combined with other depressants like alcohol or opioids, then they kill in really high numbers. On the street, you're now seeing dealers that are selling this benzodope, and it's basically fentanyl that's cut with benzos, or it's benzos that's cut with fentanyl. And these drugs are produced so cheaply in China that basically whatever is the cheapest thing on offer this week is what's going to start showing up in the drug supply.